In the soft, honey-colored light of a Houston afternoon, a little girl sat on the wooden steps of a modest family home on Parkwood Street. The air was warm and carried the gentle sweetness of magnolia blossoms drifting from the tree in the front yard. She wore her hair in neat braids, and she hummed a melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her, a tune that had not yet been written, but already felt like home. Cars rolled slowly down the quiet street, their engines a distant murmur, and the whole world seemed to pause in a comfortable, golden stillness. That girl was Beyoncé, and this porch, with its chipped white railing and the old swing that creaked in the breeze, was the very first stage she ever knew. Inside the house, the walls were filled with the sounds of a loving, bustling family. Her mother, Tina, a talented seamstress, often sat near the window stitching elaborate costumes for local beauty pageants, the sewing machine humming a steady, rhythmic lullaby. Bolts of colorful fabric lay draped over the sofa, spilling onto the floor like quiet waterfalls, and the afternoon sun traced long, lazy rectangles across the room. Her father, Matthew, worked in corporate sales, but at home he played jazz records that filled the house with the mellow, laid-back spirit of the Gulf Coast. In this warm domestic world, music was never loud or demanding. It was simply the air they breathed, a constant, gentle companion. The Knowles family lived in the Third Ward, a historically African-American neighborhood with deep roots and a quiet dignity. Rows of single-story houses sat beneath towering oak trees, their branches draped in Spanish moss that swayed like forgotten curtains. Sidewalks were cracked but swept clean, and on many evenings neighbors sat on their porches exchanging soft hellos. There was a sense of everyday rhythm here, children playing double dutch until the streetlights blinked on, the distant note of a trumpet from a nearby church, the smell of evening meals floating from open kitchen windows. It was a landscape that asked nothing of you except to belong, and it shaped a girl who would one day carry that sense of community wherever she went. Not far from the house stood St. John's United Methodist Church, a modest red brick building with a white steeple that pointed quietly toward the Texas sky. Every Sunday, the Knowles family walked through its heavy wooden doors into a sanctuary filled with amber light and the scent of old hymnals. The stained glass windows cast ribbons of emerald and sapphire across the polished pews, and the choir loft seemed to glow with a gentle, unseen warmth. It was here, among the patient harmonies of the congregation, that Beyoncé first lifted her voice in public. She was only a child, but something in the way she sang clear and earnest, like a small bell ringing, made the elderly ladies in the front row turn their heads and smile. The church choir became her earliest classroom. She learned to listen, to blend her voice with others, to feel the subtle pulse that holds a melody together. There were no spotlights, only the steady flicker of candle-sized bulbs on the altar and the patient gaze of the choir director. The songs were old spirituals and hymns that spoke of hope and endurance, and they were sung not for applause but for comfort. In that humble, sacred space, music was an offering, a quiet gift passed between the people and the high, timbered ceiling. Beyoncé absorbed this lesson without ever being told. It settled into her bones like the warmth of the Texas sun. After church, the family would sometimes drive to the lush, green expanse of Hermon Park, where the landscape opened up like a peaceful painting. The Japanese garden there was a world of its own, still ponds reflecting the sky, arched wooden bridges, and carefully raked gravel that whispered under small footsteps. Beyoncé would wander along the paths, trailing her fingers over the smooth stones, watching koi fish glide beneath the water's surface. The park was a place of quiet discovery, far from the demands of school or chores, and it offered a different kind of melody. The rustle of bamboo leaves, the distant laughter of families picnicking, the soft splash of a fountain. These sounds, too, became part of her inner library. Back on Parkwood Street, as evening settled over the neighborhood, the porch became a front-row seat to the slow descent of dusk. The sky turned shades of lavender and peach, and the streetlights blinked on one by one, casting gentle pools of light on the pavement. Sometimes Tina would come out with 2 glasses of sweet tea, and mother and daughter would sit together, listening to the cicadas begin their nightly chorus. In those unhurried moments, no one was a star, no one was rehearsing, and the world held its breath. The girl who would one day command the world's biggest stages was simply a child watching lightning bugs dance in the twilight, her heart full of quiet melody. Long before the stadium lights and the deafening applause, there was a small dance studio on a quiet side street in Houston where a young Beyoncé spent countless afternoons. The room had pale wooden floors worn smooth by years of practice, bar mirrors that reflected soft, diffused light, and a faint smell of rosin and ballet slippers. The windows were high and narrow, letting in slanted beams of sun that caught the dust motes swirling lazily in the air. Here, at the age of 7, she stood at the bar in pink tights, her small hand resting delicately on the polished wood, learning that movement itself could be a language. No one rushed, no one shouted. The only sound was the piano and the patient voice of the instructor counting out the beat. Dance taught her discipline, but it also gave her a way to understand music physically. Every note had a corresponding gesture, every rhythm a breath. After class, she would often linger in the empty studio, the mirrors reflecting a lone figure moving softly across the floor. The late afternoon sun painted the room in shades of amber and rose, and her footsteps made barely a whisper. In that solitude, she discovered that performance didn't have to be loud. It could be a private conversation between the body and the melody. This quiet understanding would later become the foundation of her legendary stage presence, a presence that could fill a stadium with nothing more than a slow walk and a steady gaze. At St. Mary's Montessori School, where she began her education, the classrooms were filled with gentle, self-directed activity. Sunlight streamed through large windows onto wooden shelves lined with colorful materials. There was a calm hum of children moving purposefully from one lesson to another, and teachers spoke in low, encouraging tones. For a naturally focused child like Beyoncé, the Montessori method was a perfect fit. She could spend long stretches of time concentrating on a single task, whether it was tracing sandpaper letters or practicing a new song under her breath, without interruption. The environment taught her that creativity needed space, silence, and patience, lessons that would echo years later when she sat in recording studios, meticulously shaping an album. Her first formal performances took place not in grand theaters, but in school talent shows and community gatherings. One evening, when she was just 7 years old, she stood on the small stage of the Sammy Davis Jr. Awards ceremony, a local competition that filled a modest auditorium with folding chairs and hopeful families. The spotlight was a simple, warm circle of light, and the audience was made up of neighbors and classmates. She sang John Lennon's Imagine in a clear, steady voice that belied her age. The room fell into a deep hush, the kind that feels almost sacred, and when the last note faded, the applause that followed was not explosive but earnest, like a collective exhale. She won the competition, but what she remembered most was that beautiful silence before the clapping. After that night, singing became something she carried with her everywhere. The Knowles household grew even more musical. Tina would often harmonize with her daughter while folding laundry, their voices blending in the sunlit hallway of the Parkwood home. Matthew, recognizing a rare spark, began video recording her impromptu living room performances. These were not rehearsals, but joyful, unguarded moments. Beyoncé standing on the coffee table using a hairbrush as a microphone, the afternoon light slanting through the blinds, her younger sister Solange dancing beside her. The footage, shot on a bulky home camcorder, captured a childhood where music was as natural as breathing, a family ritual rather than a pursuit of fame. The family's church continued to be a nurturing stage. At St. John's, she graduated from the children's choir to solo verses during morning service. She would stand at the front, her hands clasped in front of her, the congregation bathed in the jewel-toned light of the stained glass. Her voice, still pure and unaffected, carried through the wooden rafters, and the organist played with a gentle restraint that allowed every word to be heard. The elderly members of the congregation would nod gently, their heads bowed not in somber prayer but in quiet appreciation. After the service, they would press butterscotch candies into her palm and tell her she had a gift. In that sanctuary, The applause was never frantic. It was a soft murmur of amen and the rustle of Sunday dresses. When the church emptied and the last parishioners drifted home, the sanctuary fell into a deep, velvety stillness. The candles on the altar were extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint scent of wax and the residual warmth of the afternoon sun that had heated the wooden pews. Sometimes the choir director would let Beyoncé stay a little longer, sitting quietly in the front row, her feet not yet touching the floor. She would look up at the simple white cross and the arched beams overhead, and she would hum softly to herself, the same unnamed melody she had carried since the porch days. It was in these moments, alone yet utterly at peace, that she began to feel music as a sanctuary, a place where the soul could rest. As the 1990s unfolded, a new sound began to grow in a small rehearsal space in Houston, tucked away behind a strip mall. It was a plain, windowless room with beige walls and a worn gray carpet, lit only by a few fluorescent panels that hummed softly overhead. There, a group of young girls gathered several times a week, their voices weaving together in tentative harmonies that gradually gained confidence. Among them was Beyoncé, now a preteen with a quiet intensity, and alongside her were Kelly Rowland, Latavia Roberson, and Latoya Luckett. The group was first called Girls' Time, a name that spoke of youth and possibility. Their rehearsals were not glamorous. They were long, repetitive, and often exhausting, but within that unremarkable room, something extraordinary was taking shape. The girls' voices were like separate threads that, with practice, learned to intertwine into a single, luminous fabric. Their vocal coach, a patient man with a graying beard, would sit at an electric piano, playing simple chord progressions while the girls sang oohs and ahs that filled the small space. The air grew warm and close, smelling faintly of carpet cleaner and the fruit snacks the girls brought as after-school treats. Outside, the Houston heat shimmered off the asphalt parking lot, but inside, time seemed to slow down. The only light came from the glow of the keyboard and the rows of neat, handwritten lyrics taped to the wall. In that humble cocoon, they learned to listen to one another, to breathe together, to become one instrument. Matthew Knowles, who had left his corporate job to manage the group full-time, brought a sense of purpose and structure. He would sit in a folding chair against the back wall, a notebook balanced on his knee, offering quiet, measured feedback. He rarely raised his voice. His presence alone was enough to command attention. The girls came to understand that success was not a sudden flash, but a slow, steady accumulation of effort. After rehearsals, they would sometimes walk to a nearby park as the sun began its descent, the golden hour painting everything in warm, forgiving tones. They would sit on swings that moved gently back and forth, talking about their dreams, their voices soft and full of the unspoken bond that would carry them through years of challenges. The group eventually came to the attention of a legendary R&B producer who invited them to a real recording studio for the first time. That studio was a revelation, a dim, cool space with walls padded in dark foam, a vast mixing console blinking with green lights, and a large window that looked into the control room where men in headphones sat like benevolent wizards. The girls were initially shy, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. But once the engineer rolled tape, something shifted. They gathered around a single, vintage microphone, its silver grill warm under the low lighting, and began to sing. The sound that emerged was richer than anything they had produced in their rehearsal room, and for a moment, the studio itself seemed to hold its breath, the reels turning silently as their harmonies bloomed. Despite the early promise, the road was not smooth. Girls' Time appeared on a national talent search television show and lost, a moment that could have ended their journey. But the loss did not shatter them. Instead, it drove them deeper into their work. They returned to that same windowless room, now with an even deeper resolve. The fluorescent lights buzzed a little louder, it seemed, and the carpet wore thinner under their dancing feet, but their harmonies grew tighter, their choreography sharper. Beyoncé, still so young, learned a crucial lesson in that room, that a setback was simply a new note in the song, a pause before the music resumed. Her quiet determination became the glue that held the group together. even when the world outside remained indifferent. In 1997, the group was reborn as Destiny's Child and signed a major record deal. Their first official rehearsal space as signed artists was still modest, a dance room with mirrored walls and a small boombox on the floor. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, and the sound of their sneakered feet scuffing the wooden planks created an earthy rhythm. They practiced the same 8 count over and over until their bodies moved from memory alone. The mirrors reflected not just their synchronized motions, but a sisterhood that had been forged in all those afternoons of shared snacks, whispered encouragement, and silent, understanding glances. Even as the machinery of the music industry began to spin around them, they preserved the simple, almost sacred ritual of moving and singing together in a sunlit room, as if the rest of the world did not exist. When the day's rehearsals ended, Beyoncé would often stay behind for a few extra minutes. She would sit on the wooden floor, her back against the mirrored wall, and watch the late afternoon light shift and fade. The room grew quieter, the street noise beyond the glass a distant murmur, and she would pull out a small spiral notebook. In it, she wrote fragments of lyrics, observations, little melodies that came to her in the stillness. Those pages, scrawled in adolescent handwriting, were the seeds of songs that would one day be sung by millions. But for now, they were just private whispers, a girl's thoughts unfolding in the soft, golden remnants of the day.